Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Talk Nerdy podcast. I'm your host, Justin Hayward, and today's topic is anime/manga. So, my love for Japanese cartoons began back in my early childhood with the exposure of Toonami and 4Kids and the Adult Swim channels. And I was given the most popular series like Yu Yu Hakusho, One Piece, DBZ, etc. Though it wasn't until I was really 9 years old that this genre really turned into something more when I moved across the world to Okinawa, a small island off the coast of Japan. It's funny because the year before we had moved to Japan, my parents had sat my family down, and for a New Year, April Fool's prank, they were like, "Hey, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna move to China this year." And me and my family were all young kids. We were like, "Nah, that's not gonna happen." And they were finally April Fools jokingly. So the next year, whenever they said we were moving to Japan, we were like, "Wait, is this another April Fool's joke?" And it was funny because it wasn't a joke this year. And so, getting on the plane, I remember, never really leaving the country or anything. So it was a really interesting experience, just traveling and stuff, especially at such a young age. But it wasn't really until I think we got off the plane that things started to really change for me. I remember that I noticed that there was no signs or writing that I could read. Especially leaving the airport, outside the airport, there really isn't a lot of English in this area of the world. And so you're looking around and you're like, I don't know what anything says or where I'm going or who I am. And so it was my first real experience with culture shock. And so I feel like a lot of people have that similar experience when they, come to the United States for the first time, when they're not necessarily able to do the same, in reverse. So, many young children, I found, my innate interest in reading. And so my school library for my elementary school had this, because I went to an American school on a Japanese installation for the airbase. And so I would always go to the library because, it's kind of like a loner kid. So I wanted to make sure I had a place to go. And so I found myself scrolling through the books. I remember it really clearly. This library was pretty big, and they had the young kids section on the left side, and farther back they had sort of this entire section of just dedicated to manga. And I remember walking over there and I was like, oh wow, there's so many different series here. I grew up reading a lot of the series, watching DBZ or whatever, so seeing a lot of these series was really interesting for me. And so for me, one of the things I started off with was Digimon Tamers. I don't know if anyone remembers that series, but I remember just thinking to myself, oh yeah, there's this really cool Digimon show that I remember watching. And it was similar to Pokemon, so I was like, oh, this is going to be cool. But what was interesting about this series was that unlike the original series where they go into the digital world, it was more focused on the real world. And the aspects associated with the series were really about the uniquenesses within the sort of bonding aspect that Digimon shares with their specific one, because unlike Pokemon where you have a bond with multiple creatures, this is a singular creature that you bond with. And so I just remember all these sort of special abilities and stuff that they had from this series, and it was super cool, especially associated with their partnerships and sort of how they were able to basically fuse together. And it was probably one of the dopest things I ever saw as a young kid. From there, I kind of moved on to the other series that were sort of available, including Dragon Ball series. I think even as a child, I remember reading it, and I remember watching Dragon Ball Z, on TV and stuff. And obviously watching the Frieza arc was a huge thing, but the main difference between DBZ and Dragon Ball was the comedy. I think, as you get older, or maybe just as the series matured, it pulled away from its original roots of just being a slapstick comedy show and sort of gotten more into the focal battle manga sort of stylistic approach. And so I remember that was really unique about the series, as well as the world building aspects of open world adventure. That sort of sparked my brain as someone who's always constantly thinking about worlds in their own head, about seeing them visually. I think the main thing about DBZ and other One Piece or these other story arcs is I realized early on that there is a consistency amongst them where, these arcs are train, get strong, get your ass kicked, and then train some more, and then eventually you overpower the enemy, and it became sort of a cycle. And so I was constantly looking for different strategies or different stories that maybe weren't the same. I wanted to be surprised, I think. I began looking for shows and manga that held impactful storylines with deep, enriching characters. So I remember the impact that Fullmetal Alchemist had on me prior to Brotherhood. The series took a different turn than the manga predecessor, but the main portion of it, the first few episodes are very consistent, very similar to their aftermath approach. And it's because, I found out later on in life the reason why the show differs so much from the original series is because of, obviously the anime catches up to the manga so quickly. You get these filler episodes, these plots that don't really mesh with the original design of the show. I found that oftentimes a series could drive me no further away than if it was consistently creating filler episodes that did not follow the central plot or story arc. This is how series like Bleach became something I just couldn't finish. I love the first few arcs of Bleach, all the way up until the Rukia sort of capture moment. I was on the edge of my seat, and then, after enough filler episodes, you kind of just fall off. This is what led me to, I think, series like Death Note. It's been one of my favorite series. I think what made it interesting was the fact that it was darker than your average series, and the relationship between Light and L was just perfect. Of course, by the end of the series, you see the difference is the series had, and it was like, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen it. I mean, it's been out for years, but at the same time, you could see that the unique differences by the end of the series after things have occurred versus prior to, it was just a completely different series. And I think a lot of the times that happens in manga or in anime because it's a popular series and they don't want the show to end. And so they push it past its point of which it should have ended, and it ruins the flow or the vibe that the show had. But because of Death Note, I started looking for other shows and series similar. I actually found one that was made by the same creators. It's a sort of interesting series. It's called Bakuman. And what it is, it's about two young middle school boys. One of them is a artist whose uncle had passed away, who is a manga artist. He was like a famous manga artist. And then he ends up giving up drawing after his uncle's death because his family wanted him to stay away from it, until he meets this other guy who is drawn exactly like Light. So if you're, huge on that art style, then you'll probably enjoy it. It's just Light with glasses, essentially. But how it looks is he's the writer side of this, the more intellectual based. And he wants to become a manga artist, but he cannot draw. And so they create a partnership in order for them to create series. And what made this series unique was, unlike other battle manga series, their conflicts and struggles were based off of real world experiences. So they didn't just fight someone. They competed with their work. They had to outwork their competitors. And so it was constantly striving within these internal struggles and conflicts in order to create a better sort of world building strategy. And, I just fell in love with that sort of style, especially with the characters, the sort of different changing points within the series, that even if there were filler episodes within a series like this, you felt like it gave you more depth to the characters versus pulling away from the main storyline, because it is so realistic. And in the real world, there isn't a point A to point B. There is a lot of side questing and sort of ingenuity within that, which is why I think One Piece has, been so popular for so long. It's because it follows that same sort of track where an adventure isn't about getting to point A to point B. It's about what you learn along the way. And I think that's really what inspired me with a lot of the storytelling that I do. Moving into modern anime and manga, obviously like Demon Slayer and, Shield Hero are probably some of my favorite series. Because I don't know, with Demon Slayer specifically, I remember watching the first episode. And I hadn't read the manga yet because I kind of been busy with a lot of other things in my life. And so when the first episode came out, I remember Tanjiro and his fighting style. And I'm going to kind of not say too much because this is a popular series and people might not have seen this yet. But his fighting style is very unique from episode 1. Just his ingenuity and how he approached conflict was different than what I had seen other heroes do. And I think the same aspects could be shined on the Shield Hero series, where you think it's going to be a very generic sort of storyline, And that's the vibe you get from the first few moments. But then suddenly these dark twists and turns start to appear and you're like, oh my gosh, this series just got so good because I was surprised. And I think that's really what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a series or of either manga or anime. One of like the coolest ones I think I've seen that's come out is Keep Your Hands Off the Izuken. It's this really interesting series about these 3 like high school girls who all want to like make animation, but they all focus on the movement, the motion of their storytelling versus like the actual story. And so it showcases the digital life, the more of the visual effects of how you can make a world interesting and creative without focusing too much on the storyline. And to me, it was just a very different approach to many traditional mangas and anime series, and so it was just visually breathtaking. It's kind of like watching a Miyazaki film where you don't really pay attention to storyline, because if you do, you'll pop too many holes in the series, but visually you're amazed and breathtaked, and you're just like, wow, this is an amazing series. I think that as a writer, I'm constantly trying to improve my own work, and this is one of the ways that I look to find inspiration in myself and continue to create content for both my friends at the table where I play Dungeons & Dragons, and those of you at home willing to listen to me speak. Thank you guys for listening. I hope to see you next time here on Talk Nerdy to Me.